Powered by the Inside the Birds podcast. Now, live from inside the Matt Black Kia Studios. It's Football at 4.
Football at 4 is powered by the Inside the Birds podcast, and it is brought to you, as always, by our friends at Bet365. Whatever the sport, whatever the moment, it's never ordinary at Bet365. Andrew DiCecco is here on a Thursday. We'll get his thoughts on the matchups to watch, but there's a lot happening out there I want Andrew's opinion on. He is the perfect guy to have on a day like this with some questions in the secondary. He knows these players very well, and he was, of course, in the house for the Eagles' win over the Minnesota Vikings the other night and got a chance to take a look at some of these guys in person, Andrew. So let's start with that. The slot corner position is a hot topic this week. You saw Mario Goodrich last week. You know the player pretty well. How did he hold up? And would you imagine that he will get the first opportunity? And in your opinion, is he the best option to get that first spot at slot corner, replacing Avonte Maddox, who we now know is out for the season?
Yeah, well, Mario Goodrich hadn't played any NFL snaps prior to last Thursday. I think that's important to keep in mind. Played 39 snaps. I thought when he stepped in there, he looked a little bit like a player who was disjointed, didn't necessarily seem to – the game really was playing – it was going a little too fast for him. But then I thought he really acquitted himself well later in the game, all things considered. Thought he played the game a little bit more confidently, and I also thought that you saw the urgency from him. And, I mean, I really like Mario Goodrich coming out of college. I thought as an outside corner, that's really what I had him graded. I didn't really see him cross-training inside, but I really liked what I saw in the summer. And obviously he made the team for a reason. That's why he's here. So I think until he proves to you that he can't do it, I think that he's going to be the guy, and I think he should be. I think he's proven that he's proven some encouraging signs, and I think that the Eagles – he deserves a chance to prove that he can do it. And at 23 years old, you're going to see some growing pains. That's natural, but I think that you're also going to see a lot of encouraging moments from him, and he may end up parlaying that into a long-term solution for the Eagles.
Yeah, for the listeners out there, keep in mind, Maddox went down. McPherson was the original backup slot, so now you're on to your third guy here. So, all right, there's your skinny on Mario Goodrich. How does the rest of the room of the replacements potentially stack up? Is there somebody else on this roster that kind of stands out to you or intrigues you, or is Mario Goodrich definitively the best option?
Justin Evans is a player who had 135 snaps in the slot last season with the Saints. But the problem is if he's a starting safety, obviously, so if you take him out of that role and put him in the slot, then you're putting Terrell Edmonds or maybe even a Sidney Brown playing the opposite Reed Blankenship, and that kind of reconfigures the whole infrastructure of the defense. Sidney Brown maybe isn't entirely ready to play, or Terrell Edmonds, for example, his skill set compared to opposite Reed Blankenship is pretty redundant. So I think that it kind of hamstrings you to a degree, and it doesn't necessarily make you the most efficient defense if you have to deploy your personnel that way. So I think that Goodrich makes the most sense to get the nod early and see what you got. I think that he's going to have to take his lumps, but I think ultimately he's somebody that I think that has a lot of promise, and the team has invested a year and a half in, or a year and some change. So let's see that through. I think that makes the most sense. And then there's also James Bradbury, of course, who was cross-trained inside in training camp, but I don't necessarily think that's a long-term solution or a viable one at that. He's a perimeter corner by trade, and he's making $12+ million a year. I don't think you want to get somebody who's an all-pro corner, kick him inside permanently. I think that's more matchup-based against the Travis Kelce's, Darren Waller's, George Kittle's, and players of that mold. And you might see him slide inside situationally.
Yeah, we know that last week you had Maddox and Bradbury out. Bradbury should be back, but Josh Jobe, is he a guy, first off, how did you think he performed in the game? And is he a guy that can be cross-trained? Because, for years, Andrew, they seemingly picked up a corner in every trade. I likened it to a team that just says, hey, throw me a single-A pitcher back in return. It felt like the Eagles just kept getting corner after corner after corner, and this room is filled with a lot of these young corners, and it seems that none of them are suited to play the slot.
Right, and Eli Ricks is an interesting player because he's a little bit longer, so you don't necessarily attribute that his skill set and body type to be akin to playing the slot. But that's not to say he can't do it. But I think that what you have three guys there that are probably better suited to do that. But I mean, it's really interesting to see. I think that I really do think that Mario Goodrich is best equipped to do that. And it's such an important position in today's NFL to be able to handle all different types of receivers and body types. And it's an integral role on the Eagles defense right now. They have a position coach for the first time that specifically oversees that position.
All right, Andrew DiCecco, let's look at some of the matchups here. By the way, Trayvon Diggs, talk about corners. Looks like Diggs may have torn his ACL today at practice for the Cowboys, and that could be a huge loss on that defense. And we're talking about injuries. The Eagles getting healthier here. Bradbury looked to get back. James Bradbury at the corner, and then, of course, at safety, last week you lost Reed Blankenship. And how was the safety configuration in that game last week? You had Justin Evans. Wait, real quick, before we get to that, Sidney Brown was a guy who played a little bit of slot corner at Illinois. Would he be an option for you?
Well, I would have to say no, and the reason being is it doesn't make sense to put a lot more on our rookie's plate when he's still trying to master his primary position. But it is something to keep in mind down the line, perhaps. Mm-hmm. But I think right now you want to see him find his footing at safety first. And I have to think that this 10-day layoff may help his cause to maybe seeing a little bit more of a prominent role defensively. 3 games in, or you've beat 3 games in now, and I think sort of it takes a little while for some defensive backs to really find their way in the NFL. And so I'm interested to see if he's going to get some more snaps because he obviously has the highest upside, the most dynamic of their safety players. And real quick to go back on your last question, you mentioned a lot of the young defensive backs, and I have to, I wanted to touch on Josh Jobe, who you asked about, and I think that he performed pretty well given the circumstances. I think that he would like to have that 63-yard touchdown back, but I also think there's a lot more involved with that play than the naked eye would tell you. I think that there was safety help that probably was being expected there. But I thought early on he really rose to the occasion. The lights weren't too bright for him. This is a guy who played at the highest level of college football, very physical player. I mentioned that to you before the game. I didn't expect him to be shell-shocked in any sense, and I thought he acquitted himself pretty well. I think that you see there's some hiccups and growing pains as you would any player, especially one like Josh Jobe, who only had 20 defensive snaps going into last Thursday. But I think that he's a confident player that will continue to carve out a role and gain confidence the more he plays. And then to your safety position, what you asked about, Terrell Edmunds, I thought he obviously made a heads-up play. That was his first forced fumble of his career, believe it or not, on Justin Jefferson in the end zone there for the touchback. But ultimately, I think that the safety, you don't have a whole lot of safeties that are interchangeable. I think that you have Justin Evans, who's a really good pass defending safety, and that's obviously why he would garner some consideration for the slot.
Right.
But I think Terrell Edmunds is more of a rotational type of player. He's an ordinary player, but someone you can depend on, and I think he can have a situational role. Like I said, I really want to see what they can do with Sidney Brown because I think that he deserves a little bit of more of a longer look if he has the system down, if they have enough confidence in him to put him out there.
All right, I want to get your take on we were talking secondary. Let's stay there and look at this game. You've got this secondary slot situation, Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. How do you think this matchup looks for Philadelphia's secondary?
Yeah, that's going to be really interesting, especially to see what they choose to do with Mike Evans. So, I mean, if they move Mike Evans in the slot at any point, I think that's when, Mike, you would see a James Bradbury draw that assignment. But I think if you see a Chris Godwin hanging out in the slot as he typically does, you would see more of a Mario Goodrich there, and I think they would play them more straight up like that. But, I mean, you have 2 receivers with varying skill sets. Mike Evans is a tough ask for anybody, especially someone coming back off of a week off and Bradbury off that concussion. I think that with the way Baker Mayfield's playing right now, it's actually really surprising to say, but he's playing pretty confident football, and we'll see if he's able to stack a third game of playing, some competent quarterback play there. But if the Eagles pass rush can get home and bear down on them, I think that they can take the passing game or I think they could take their Mike Evans and Chris Godwin out of the game. And the Eagles pass rush, it looked like it was starting to catch fire late in that game, particularly Josh Sweat. So I think that's where the game is going to be won, and I think that they're really starting to hit their stride there.
That's going to be an interesting one. I want to get your thoughts then on no Nakobe Dean. They went with Nick Morrow, and how the linebackers held up. T.J. Hawkinson is a top-level tight end. Tampa Bay doesn't really use the tight end a lot, so I'm interested to see how the linebackers will match up in this game.
Yeah, so I thought Nicholas Morrow, by the way, did a really nice job. And you didn't hear his name called a lot. I saw in one instance where he was helping a young defensive back, I can't remember which one, with their assignment, with their alignment, and I thought he was in full control. Remember, this is a guy who had the green dot in Chicago, so to see him wear the green dot on Thursday night wasn't necessarily a surprise. He's a really smart player, and having him and Zach Cunningham manning the inside, I thought gives them a good pairing of veteran players that have seen a lot of football. Morrow, obviously, the most adept in pass coverage of the two. And I didn't see – I thought Zach Cunningham, for that matter, had a pretty strong game. But Morrow, to me, was probably one of the more unsung heroes, especially coming off the practice squad. He was initially signed to be the starter. He was a relatively surprising cut at the end of the summer. And on the practice squad, he steps right in, and you would think that he was on the team from the get-go, the way he performed. I think that you're going to probably see that duo again this weekend with Christian Ellis mixed in as the third linebacker. But I think Morrow gives you that pass coverage, sideline to sideline linebacker who is going to be at the controls with the green dot once again and provide some stability there. And then Zach Cunningham being that tough, tenacious downhill player. I think they complement each other pretty well. I think the Eagles are making the best out of their linebacker situation right now and finding different ways to kind of best accentuate what they do best.
Andrew DiCecco, football for InsideTheBirds.com. The Eagles, we always think up front, are going to win, but the least sacked quarterback in the league so far is Baker Mayfield. So what kind of challenge does the Eagle defensive front have this week against a team like Tampa Bay, who had all sorts of problems up front last year?
Yeah, listen, Tampa Bay, they have Tristan Wirfs is one of the best in the business. Cody Mauch, who they drafted in the second round, is their guard, and I think he's a big, imposing presence there. And Baker's getting the ball out pretty quickly, and there are certain things that they're going to do. Teams in general are going to try and do to combat the Eagles' pass rush, especially with a year of film on them, and try and find creative ways to keep them at bay. And I think it certainly helps having the receiving core that they have. But I really like the Eagles, the way that the Eagles are rotating, and Sean Desai is deploying his personnel and the different looks that he's giving. I think it's going to keep Tampa Bay on their heels. You're going to see Jalen Carter take advantage of that middle. I think Milton Williams has really been one of the most overlooked players on the Eagles' defensive line. He's often forgotten about, but he's a player that I thought really has caught my eye over the past couple of games. Fletcher Cox is playing at an extremely high level, and Josh Sweat, really, you saw after halftime last Thursday. It feels like that game was forever ago, and I thought that he really was starting to catch fire there. So I think it's just a tough matchup for any offensive line, and I think ultimately they're going to be able to get home, and they're going to rattle Baker Mayfield, and I think that's going to be the game within the game now.
Yeah, let's talk to Andrew about the offense then. Eagles on the offensive side of the ball. We know Minnesota, I think if you, me, Mosher, Kaplan, Josh, producer Danny here put up a running game, we might get yards on the ground against that Minnesota defense. Not the same this week. This is a very stout run defense. So how does the Eagle run game, 48 carries for 250 last week, how does it match up against Tampa Bay this week?
Yeah, and I think that you're certainly not. I certainly don't anticipate another 175-yard game from DeAndre Swift or anything like that. I think it's going to be some tough sledding inside. Vita Vea is there, of course. Kalijah Cansey. Their linebacking core is with Devin White, Levante David, and I just think that they have a really, really stout defensive front, and that's going to pose some problems for the Eagles. But the Eagles, I'll take the Eagles' offensive line over any. And generating holes and finding ways to move guys around and find, get the running game going. I think that they're going to try and find a way to keep it balanced. But this is a game, Mike, where Jalen Hurts is really going to have to, and the Eagles' offense, for that matter, is really going to have to take to the air and get things going there fairly early, because I think Tampa Bay is going to look to prove that they're going to shut down the run early and make the Eagles one-dimensional. At least I think that's what their approach is going to be. And that, to me, is going to be really telling to see where the Eagles are 3 games in from a passing game standpoint and how they're able to kind of maybe get an A.J. Brown going. Sometimes those slant routes, I think he's the best in the business at doing that. Get some easy completions for Jalen, and that might open up the whole playbook. But I think that they're going to have to really gain a lot of yards through the air than this one.
Well, they haven't done that so far this year, so is that matchup there for them to be able to finally get that pass game going against this Tampa defense?
Yeah, I think so. I think they can do it. I don't know that Dallas Goedert's going to be as much of a factor because I really like what they have from a second-level defensive standpoint in Tampa. I think they're pretty fluid in coverage. But I think that A.J. can have a big game. I think Devontae in particular should really thrive in this matchup. I don't know what they're going to do at third receiver. I have to look and see what the injury report's like because if you remember, Quez Watkins left the game last Thursday with a hamstring injury. Olamide Zaccheaus was the third receiver. But I think, just looking at it from that standpoint, I think Devontae in particular should have a really big game here. And you want to see Jalen start to pick up some yards early through the air because there was opportunities and guys are running free. So I think that this, 3 games in, you start to get in the flow of things. Remember, September is oftentimes the preseason for a lot of NFL starters. You see a lot of inadequate play across the league, a lot of sloppy play. But at late September, October is when teams start to hit their stride, and I think you're going to see that in the Eagles' case.
All right, Andrew DiCecco, football at 4 here on the Sports Bash. We've got that game on Monday night, so it's still a couple days away. But overall, Tampa, I think, is a surprise 2-0. Philadelphia expected to be 2-0, yet people think they haven't been their best yet. So what is, the key matchup, the X factor, as you generally write about over at InsideTheBirds.com, that you think will stand out in this one?
I think the Eagles' offensive line and running game versus the Tampa Bay defense, which is pretty stout against the run. I think that it can make the Eagles one-dimensional. I'm curious to see what Brian Johnson has cooked up and see if they're able to generate those yards through the air because we really haven't seen a lot of that when they had to do it. So that, to me, was something I'm going to be keeping an eye on. And I think that 3 games in, you're going to start to see what the offense is actually going to be. They had those 10 days, give or take, to really fine-tune some things and get back to the drawing board in some aspects. I think you're going to see a much more refined, free-flowing offense, and they're going to put up points, and I think that's really what they ultimately are.
All right. By the way, you were in the locker room, right, on Thursday night after that game. Any sense of any carryover or anything would happen from this Hurts, A.J. Brown kerfuffle?
None at all. I see it as a non-issue. 2 competitive players. AJ is an emotional player. They have a long-standing history. They're really good friends, and this also happened last year, and they made it to the Super Bowl, and it was a non-issue throughout the rest of that season. So I look at it as much ado about nothing, and until it comes up again, Mike. Unless that happens again, then you might see a little bit more of a pattern, and then that might cause for a little bit of a little skepticism there. But right now, I wouldn't make too much of it.
I would agree. And by the way, AJ did address it today, and we'll have that coming up for you a little bit later on the Sports Bash. He is Andrew DiCecco, football at 4, of course, every day right here with the Inside the Birds guys. And, of course, you can check out Andrew at InsideTheBirds.com for his thoughts on the Eagles and the Buccaneers down there in Tampa this Monday night on 97.3 ESPN. Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, man. Have a good one.